Jacob Abadai was born on May 3rd, 1654. He was a French Protestant minister and a very popular writer during his time. At only age 17, he graduated with a doctorate in theology, and then at age 22 wrote his first book, titled The Truth of the Christian Religion. He went on to become a minister in Berlin, Germany at a French church. And then while in Berlin, he made several visits to the Netherlands in 1684, 1686, and 1688. Then in 1688, he ended up moving to England and became a minister of a French church of Savoy, London. Some of the books that Jacob Abadai wrote during his lifetime included the book titled Deals with the Truth of the Christian Religion, a book titled The Deity of Jesus Christ, Essential to the Christian Religion, a book titled The Truth of the Reformed Christian Religion, and in 1723, he authored a book titled The Triumph of Providence in Religion. Now, Jacob Abadai wrote many other books, but this book, The Triumph of Providence and Religion, is the one that I'd like to highlight in this discussion of this man's life and ministry. And the reason being is this man believed and taught that the white Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, and Scandinavian, and Celtic, and kindred people were in fact direct descendants of the Israel people of the Bible. This belief and doctrine would later be known as Anglo-Israel truth or Anglo-Israelism later on, and many people falsely believe and teach that this was invented during the 1800s. But here we have a man in 1723 writing about it. And he's not the only one. There was people before him as well. There was John Sadler, for example, in 1649, who wrote The Kingdom or Customs of Our Ancestors, which proclaimed the same truth. And then before him, we have French Huguenot Councillor Le Royal, who published a book in 1590 titled The Lost Tribes Found. And in all these books I just mentioned, the authors proclaimed that the Anglo-Saxon and kindred people were direct descendants of the Israel of the Bible. In Jacob Abadai's book, The Triumph of Providence and Religion, here's a quote from that book where he says, quote, "Certainly, unless the 10 tribes have flown into the air or have been plunged to the earth's center, they must be sought in the part of the north which in the time of Constantine was converted to Christian faith, namely among the Iberians, the Armenians, the Scythians, for that was the place of their dispersion, the wilderness, where God caused them to dwell in tents, as when they came out of the land of Egypt." End quote. So there you have it. Another minister, even farther back than the 1800s, believing in what is now known as the Anglo-Israel truth.
Let's take a look at some extracts from Abadai's Triumph and Providence of Religion, translated from the original French. On page 164 we read, "The Assyrians transported the Israelites and made them live in Halath and on the river Habor of Gozan and in the towns of the Medes." This map shows the location of Media and Gozan. On page 165, the 10 tribes of Israel, transported as one body in an entire migration, so complete that after they had left, their country was only inhabited by lions and wild beasts. On page 166, they all occupied that part of Europe which is between the Euxine Bridge and the Caspian Sea. They lived in the outlying districts of Assyria in Colchester, Iberia, Scythia, and that is exactly the northern district where Constantine raised the standard of the cross, and where can be found an abundant harvest of Gentiles converted to the Christian faith.
So the Israelite captives migrated in huge numbers after their captivity in the 8th century BC. Constantine was crowned emperor in York, in England, in 306 AD. He was said to have seen a vision of the cross of Jesus superimposed on the sun, accompanied by the words, "In this sign conquer." And by the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, he formally recognized Christianity in the Roman Empire. And that's an extract from Hutchinson's encyclopedia. This is an image of St. Helen's Church in Colchester, England, and you'll notice a board outside which explains the origins of St. Helen's Church. St. Constantine the Great, first Christian emperor of Rome, was said in Western tradition to have been born in this city. He is saluted in Colchester's 14th century archives as most Christian emperor, flower of Britain, citizen of Colchester. The West has not generally regarded him as a saint, but the Orthodox Church does, calling him and his mother equals to the apostles, for the huge influence they both had on the life of the Church. Before his victory over the city of Rome itself, he saw a vision of the cross of Christ in the sky outside Rome. St. Helen, his mother, was also said to have been born here in her supposed father, King Coel's palace, where the castle now stands. On page 117 we read, in the Triumph of Providence, "Unless the 10 tribes had vanished into the air or disappeared into the depths of the earth, we should probably look for them in the north, and in that part of the north which in Constantine's time was converted to Christianity, namely amongst the Iberians, the Armenians and the Scythians. Of these 10 tribes it was predicted that, scattered by the anger of God, they would be led into a second desert, a wandering life. Will they not return to Egypt, says Hosea, chapter 11, and will not Assyria rule over them? And then further on, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. I will make you live in tents again." Israel would find itself amongst the nomadic Scythians. And so the migration took place of the so-called lost tribes of Israel into the regions around the Black Sea. Although the Israelites had to be wanderers and would scatter among the nations, on page 173, they would not, however, get lost among them entirely. This is what Amos says, "Surely the eyes of the sovereign Lord are on the sinful kingdom. I will destroy it from the face of the earth." That is a reference, he says, to the government in Samaria. "Yet I will not totally destroy the house of Jacob, declares the Lord, for I will give my commands, and I will shake the house of Israel among all nations as grain is shaken in a sieve, and without a grain falling to the ground." It had been predicted about the people of Ephraim that they would grow in number in their exile, and that after being abandoned by God during their scattering, they would find him again in their scattering. This is what the prophet Hosea wants us to hear in the first chapter of his Revelations. Here he deliberately distinguishes Judah from the 10 tribes. So Israel is to find God again, though heathen, in terms of the new covenant that was made with Israel. Lawyer and historian Sharon Turner published his History of the Anglo-Saxons first in 1799 and traced much of Eurasian ancestry to the Scythians. The Anglo-Saxons, he says, Norman Lowland Scots, Normans, Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, Germans, Dutch, Belgians, Lombards and Franks have all sprung from that, notice the words he uses, that great fountain of the human race which we have distinguished by the terms Scythian, German or Gothic. John Wilson was an accomplished 19th century theological historian. He studied at Trinity College, Dublin, and he popularly lectured on his extensive research into the lost tribes of Israel. He cites the work of Jacques Abadie. And he says on page 270, we are, however, to look for the descendants of all Israel, not only among the Germans and their Anglo-Saxon offspring, but also in Italy and especially in France and Switzerland. The Goths, some of whom passed northward into Scandinavia, the Ostrogoths who turned southward into sunny Italy, and the Visigoths into Spain. In his book American Zion, the writer Aaron Shaley says, Jewish scholars have never doubted the existence of the lost tribes of Israel. On chapter 4 of his book he states, a succession of Jewish travellers from Eldad the Danite in the 9th century to Benjamin Tudela in the 12th and Abraham Mordecai Pharisol in the 15th kept the interest in the lost tribes alive throughout the Middle Ages. Many Jewish scholars have but made the mistake of searching for the lost tribes of Israel only amongst people who had some sort of Jewish customs, such as circumcision or the keeping of the Sabbath or the food laws. But the lost tribes became heathen Gentiles and lost their Israelite identity. Then, receiving the gospel of the new covenant in Christ, formed the Christian nations in Asia and Europe. This is what Abadie recognized. So in conclusion, the lost sheep of the house of Israel became Eurasian Gentile peoples, subsequently forming Christian nations, the nation and company of nations promised to the patriarch Jacob Israel. Abadie understood this. He certainly understood the references in Genesis and Jeremiah 31. And so here is an image of Jacob Israel as painted by the artist Zubaran, depicted as represented in the book of the Hebrews, Jacob in old age leaning upon his staff and worshipping God. And so we can say that God has honoured his promises made to Jacob Israel in the Christian nations of the Nordic, Anglo-Saxon, Celtic and related peoples. Promise such as thou shalt spread abroad to the west, the east, the north and the south. In other words, prolific colonizers. A nation of company of nations shall be of thee. Many nations. And in thee and thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And all Bible commentators recognize that promise as people who are agents of Christian missions.